In this tutorial, we're going to go over the formula tool. Now, we've previously filtered our data so that only the first and last 10 years are loaded. However, we actually care about the difference between them. But we care about the difference as a group. We don't care about individual years within the range. A formula tool will let us specify some rules and create a new column that has the more summarized form of our data. So we will click and drag formula, and we're going to have it come out of the true line. Because remember, we're only interested in data that meets the criteria of first or last 10 years, so true is fine. In our formula tool, we're going to go and select that we want to add a new column. They suggest year bucket in the chapter, so we'll just stick with that. And now we're going to say what we want our rules to be for that. So similar to when we were using the filter expression, we're going to write some rules here. However, with filter, true and false come out of different lines. In this case, they're going to go into the same column. So we'll actually use a full if, then, else, instead of just using what the rules are within the if statement. So we're going to say if, and once we type that in, it might helpfully pop up with if, then, else, and if, which is how the formula works in its simplest form. And that's actually good enough for what we need here. Now it has some default conditions in here that we will replace with whatever rules we want. So let's start with if year is less than 1890, then first 10. So I'm going to input a couple of new lines here to make this a little easier for me to read. Or I'm going to enter and then do that instead of being so helpful with the autocomplete. These new lines are just to help me understand exactly what's being said. Alteryx is going to completely ignore them, but I like having the rules across multiple lines so I know exactly what I'm typing in to each space within the formula. So we have if year is less than 1890, that's our condition. Then first 10 is the output we want. So first 10 is what will go into our data. If that isn't true, we'll follow the else. For the else, we're going to say last 10. So if the year is less than 1890, first 10. If it's after 1890, last 10. We don't need to include another rule about if it's after 2003, because the filter step means that there is no data between 1890 and 2003. So there isn't a middle 100 years possibility that we'll run into. Finally, it ends with an end if, which is how we close the block and tell it everything is good and dandy, don't try and find more instructions. Final step before we drop a browse tool and click run to make sure everything worked is we're going to change the data type from a variable string to a string, and we are going to specify that the length is 16. Again, I know that 16 is more characters than this is, but the important thing is I want it to be fixed relatively small instead of allowing it to grow as crazy big or small. It shouldn't make a difference, but if I made a mistake somewhere earlier on, it's possible that something big and crazy could go in there. It's important to control for what happens if there was a mistake. It's especially important when you consider that you may want to reuse this exact workflow again, but on different source data. And maybe that source data isn't in exactly the same format you were expecting. The person you got it from told you it was, but other people aren't always accurate either. So having some sort of sanity checking and reasonable rules and boundedness is important. Now that I've got that selected, I'm going to pull out a browse tool and bring it out of here. And I will click run. as it runs through and finishes very quickly. I can now go into the Browse tool, and we'll notice that in addition to the 4 columns we had before, we have a new column called Year Bucket. Also worth noting, we're down to 5,000 records compared to the 34,000 we had before. We applied our filter step. So we have a smaller amount of data, but it's only the data we're interested in, and we've categorized it into useful groups.